There is a specific image from The Walking Dead that tends to come back when you think about Shane Walsh. It is not one of the big moments. It is not the barn or the field or any of the scenes people usually talk about. It is something quieter than that. It is Shane standing at a fence line somewhere on Herschel Green's farm, just looking out at nothing in particular. The farm is behind him, the fields are in front of him, and he is just standing there, very still, in a way that does not quite fit the man everyone around him thinks he is. That image is a good place to start, because Shane Walsh is a character who spent most of his time on The Walking Dead, standing slightly apart from the group, looking at things nobody else wanted to look at, and saying things nobody else wanted to hear. And for that, most people remember him as the villain, the guy who went off the rails, the guy who lost his mind somewhere between King County and that farm and became something the show needed to put down. That reading is understandable. It is not entirely wrong, but it is not the whole picture. And the whole picture is genuinely more interesting than the simplified version. This video is going to spend some time with Shane, not to argue that he was a good man exactly, or that he should have survived, or that the show made a mistake in how it handled him. Just to look at him a bit more completely than he usually gets looked at, to follow the logic of his choices rather than just the consequences of them, to ask in an honest way whether the reading most people settled on was really the most accurate one available. It is going to take a while. That is fine. There is no rush. But before we begin, if you could just take a moment to subscribe, it is completely free, and it genuinely helps this channel more than you know. Anyway, that is enough of that. Let us get into it. The best place to start, as it usually is with Shane Walsh, is the very beginning. Before the walkers, before the farm, before any of this was anyone's problem. The thing that gets lost in almost every conversation about Shane Walsh is how genuinely good he was at being Shane Walsh. Before the apocalypse, before any of the choices that define how most people remember him, before the barn and the school and the field where everything ended, The Walking Dead does not spend a great deal of time in the before. The show opens in media res, more or less. Rick wakes up in a hospital, the world has already fallen apart, and the story moves forward from there. But the glimpses of the world before the outbreak that the show does provide are carefully chosen. The pilot episode, Days Gone By, gives us a brief but genuinely important scene. Shane and Rick sitting in a patrol car before anything has happened, talking about women, talking about relationships, ribbing each other the way men do when they have known each other long enough to be comfortable. It is a small scene. It runs maybe 2 or 3 minutes, but it does something essential, which is establish that these two men liked each other, genuinely liked each other. Not in the way that people in a professional relationship are obligated to get along, but in the easy, specific way that real friendship produces. The shorthand, the gentle mockery, the willingness to be honest without it feeling like an attack. That matters. It matters more than it might seem, because everything Shane does in seasons 1 and 2 is shaped by it. The friendship between Shane Walsh and Rick Grimes was the foundational relationship of his life. Rick was not just his partner on the job. Rick was his person, the one he talked to, the one he trusted, the one whose opinion of him carried weight. Understanding that is not a small thing when it comes to understanding the rest of Shane's story. Shane in the world before the apocalypse was, by every available account, a competent and capable man. He was a sheriff's deputy in King County, Georgia. He was good at the job, not in a quietly heroic way, but in the practical day-to-day sense of someone who shows up, does what is needed, and handles situations without drama. He was physically capable, decisive, and apparently well-liked by the people around him. He was also, by the evidence of the pilot, funny. There is a version of Shane Walsh who exists entirely in a world that did not end, and that version is probably someone you would want around. Someone who would be useful at a barbecue, and useful in a crisis, and relatively easy to spend time with in between. His relationship with Laurie before the outbreak is one of the show's more carefully managed ambiguities. The show never makes explicit whether Shane had romantic feelings for Laurie while Rick was alive and present and everything was normal. It leaves that question open, and it does so deliberately. What it does make clear is that Shane had a genuine relationship with Carl, Rick and Laurie's son, that predated any of the romantic entanglement. Shane knew Carl as a child. He cared about him. When the world ended and Rick was not there, Shane's protectiveness of Carl did not feel like performance or strategy. It felt like the extension of something that was already there. And then the world ended, and Shane was there for it. What Shane did next is the part that tends to get skipped over in the rush to get to the parts people want to argue about. But it matters. It matters enormously because it establishes something about Shane that the later narrative works very hard to make you forget. Shane kept people alive, not metaphorically, not in the abstract. He organised a group of strangers and near strangers, Laurie, Carl, Dale, Andrea, Glenn, Carol, the others, into something resembling a functional survival unit. And he did it in the immediate aftermath of civilization's collapse, when nobody had a template for what was happening, and nobody knew the rules of the new world because the rules had not been written yet. He set up the camp at the quarry outside Atlanta. He established watch rotations. He made decisions about where to forage, when to move, how to manage resources. He did the unglamorous, exhausting, largely thankless work of keeping a group of terrified people organised enough to survive from one day to the next. The show does not dwell on this period. It happens largely off-screen, in the gap between the flashbacks to King County and the present tense action of the pilot. But the evidence of it is everywhere in those early episodes. The camp exists. It is functional. People are fed. Children are protected. There is a system, however rough, and that system was built by Shane. Not by committee, not by consensus, by Shane operating on instinct and training and a stubborn refusal to let the people around him die. Think about what that required. Not just the physical competence, though, that was real. The emotional labour of it. Holding a group together when every person in that group was processing unimaginable loss. Making decisions for people who are too shocked or too grief-stricken to make decisions for themselves. Being the person everyone looked to, every hour of every day, when the answer to almost every question was, "I don't know, but we need to do something." Shane bore that weight. He bore it alone, and he bore it while carrying his own grief. For Rick, for the world he had lost, for the life he would never get back. Laurie and Carl were alive because of Shane. That is not an opinion. That is the show's own text. They were alive because he got them out of King County. They were alive because he kept them fed and sheltered and protected through those first impossible weeks. They were alive because Shane Walsh decided, in the absence of any larger structure or authority or plan, that keeping them alive was the thing he was going to do. And then he did it. That is the man who was waiting at the quarry when Rick Grimes walked out of the woods. Not a villain, not a man positioning himself for advantage. A man who had already done the hardest thing he would ever do, and who did not know yet that the hardest thing was about to be undone. The specific sequence of events that the show gives us around the hospital is worth dwelling on, because it tends to get compressed in most discussions of Shane's character. The outbreak began. King County became dangerous quickly. Shane went to the hospital where Rick was in a coma, in the intensive care unit, unconscious, connected to machines, completely unresponsive. The power in the hospital went out. There were gunshots in the corridor. Things were moving fast in the way that catastrophic things move, all at once and without warning. Shane checked Rick's vitals and could find no pulse. The corridor outside the room was full of sounds that made clear the situation was beyond saving, and so Shane left. But before he left, he did something that most viewers either forget or never fully registered. He pushed a gurney against the door of Rick's hospital room. A metal gurney positioned to block the door, to slow whatever was coming, to give Rick, who Shane believed was already dead, some additional barrier between his body and the chaos outside. It was not a grand gesture. It was not the kind of thing that gets remembered as heroic. It was a small, practical, almost unconscious act of protection for a man Shane had already concluded was gone. Think about what that detail means. Shane did not abandon his friend. He could not have abandoned his friend because in his understanding of the situation, his friend was already dead. He said goodbye to Rick. He blocked the door, and then he left to survive. Everything that follows, every decision Shane made, every moral compromise, every act of violence, everything the show eventually uses to frame him as dangerous and wrong, was made by a man who had already processed one of the most destabilizing experiences a human being can have. He had watched the world collapse. He had lost his best friend. He had grieved. He had kept Laurie and Carl alive through sheer force of will and professional competence. He had built a version of life in the ruins of everything, a purpose, a family of sorts, a reason to keep going. And then Rick Grimes had walked back out of the dead world, alive, and stood there in front of all of it. Not X, not a man who had been calculating all along, not a predator who had used the apocalypse to take something he wanted. A man who had already mourned what he lost, rebuilt around the loss, and then been handed the loss back. Complicated, impossible, full of implications that had no clean resolution. That is the position from which Shane Walsh operated for 2 seasons of television. That is the ground under all of it. He was not crazy, he was not evil. He was a man in a situation that did not have a good answer, and the way he handled the absence of a good answer is, when you look at it carefully, more coherent than it is usually given credit for. His attachment to Carl throughout season 1 is not incidental. The swimming lessons, the moments of protective instinct, the scenes where Shane and Carl interact with the easy familiarity of people who have been in each other's lives long enough to not need to perform anything. That relationship was real, and it mattered to Shane in a way that went beyond strategy or manipulation. Carl was not a means to an end for Shane. Carl was a child he loved, in the uncomplicated way that people love children they have watched grow up. The fact that this love became tangled up with the rest of the mess, with Laurie, with Rick, with the pregnancy question that would hover over everything, does not retroactively make it false. John Bernthal, who played Shane, has spoken in various interviews about making a deliberate separation between Shane in the before and Shane in the after. The physical work alone, the way he held his body, the quality of his stillness, the specific tension he carried in his jaw and his shoulders, shifted across the 2 seasons in ways that were intentional and precise. The Shane of the pilot car scene is loose. He moves easily. He laughs. The Shane of the farm is coiled, guarded, always slightly ahead of himself in a way that reads as aggression, but is more accurately described as hypervigilance. Something happened to Shane between those 2 moments. Something real and large and irreversible. And understanding that transition is understanding the character. The simplest way to put it is this: Shane Walsh was a good man in a world that had a use for good men. And then the world changed. And the question the show spent 2 seasons asking, about Shane specifically, but about everyone in the group, was whether goodness was a quality that survived the change, or whether it was a feature of a particular kind of world, contingent on the conditions that had produced it. Shane's answer turned out to be the hard one. But it was an answer. It was his answer. And it came from a specific place in a specific person who had lived through a specific set of things. That is worth knowing before anything else. Most people who watched The Walking Dead remember Shane as the guy who slowly went crazy. And that is not an unfair reading as far as it goes. The show provides plenty of evidence for it. Shane's behaviour becomes more erratic. His methods become more extreme. His relationship with the group deteriorates in ways that are difficult to watch. By the time the 2nd season reaches its midpoint, Shane has become a source of genuine dread for people around him, and the audience has largely been positioned to share that dread. But the crazy reading stops short of the more interesting question. which is not whether Shane lost it, but whether he was actually wrong. Because Shane's philosophy, the thing underneath the behaviour, the argument he kept making in various forms across 2 seasons of television, was not nihilism, it was not cruelty, it was not the expression of a man who had abandoned ethics in favour of appetite. It was something more specific and more uncomfortable than that. Shane's philosophy was a coherent position about what survival actually required, and the show takes it seriously, even as it ultimately rejects it. Here is the core of Shane's argument, stated as plainly as possible. In the world before the apocalypse, certain moral frameworks held because they were sustainable. The idea that every life has equal value, that mercy is a virtue, that the stranger deserves the benefit of the doubt. These are not just nice ideas. They are the accumulated wisdom of societies that could afford them, that had enough margin and enough stability to absorb the costs of operating this way. In a world with walkers, Shane argued, that margin no longer existed. Hesitation kills people. Sentimentality kills people. The decision to treat every life as sacred, including the lives of people who might get you killed, is a luxury the apocalypse cannot accommodate. That argument is made explicitly in several scenes, and it deserves to be engaged with on its own terms before being evaluated. Season 2, Episode 8, an episode called Nebraska, contains one of the show's most honestly staged confrontations between Rick and Shane about the direction of the group. Shane is not raving in that scene. He is not out of control. He is making an argument, steadily and with conviction, and Rick is struggling to counter it, not because Shane is wrong about the facts, but because Rick has a different relationship to the cost of being right. The Randall situation is the clearest example of Shane's philosophy in action, and the most uncomfortable one for viewers who have already decided he is simply losing his mind. The group captured a young man named Randall, a stranger connected to a potentially hostile group, and debated endlessly about what to do with him. The debate is staged in Season 2, Episode 11, an episode called Judge, Jury, Executioner, and it is one of the show's most genuinely argued sequences. Shane's position is simple. This man is a potential threat. In a world like this, potential threats do not get the benefit of the doubt. You cannot release him because he knows where you are. You cannot keep him indefinitely because you do not have the resources. The math has one answer. The group found this position repugnant. Dale, the group's moral compass in early seasons, argues passionately against it. Rick resists it. The audience is positioned to resist it. And yet, and this is the thing the show does not entirely hide, the subsequent events of the season and the series repeatedly vindicate Shane's assessment of situations like Randall's. Strangers who were given the benefit of the doubt and turned out to be threats. Communities that failed to act decisively when they had the chance and paid catastrophic prices for the hesitation. The show keeps confirming Shane's forecast while simultaneously condemning his character. He was right about Randall. He was right about the barn. He was right about the farm's vulnerability to attack. He was right about what Rick would eventually become. He was, by most empirical measures, the show's most accurate forecaster of consequences. The things Shane said would happen kept happening, season after season, long after Shane himself was gone. Being right and being good are not the same thing. Shane understood the first part. He just could not hold on to the second. And that distinction is important. The show is not ultimately arguing that Shane's predictions were wrong. It is arguing that his prescriptions were wrong. That knowing the hard truth about a situation does not automatically determine the right response to it. That there is a difference between acknowledging that the world is brutal and deciding to be brutal in it. Shane collapsed that distinction. He moved from "the world requires hard choices" to "I am the one who should make them," to making them without accountability is acceptable in a progression that the show traces with considerable care. The moments where Shane's decisiveness genuinely saved lives are real and should be acknowledged. the department store in Season 1, when Shane's quick thinking gets the group out of a dangerous situation. The CDC escape, where Shane's physical capability and willingness to act without deliberation matter enormously. Early Shane is not a liability, he is an asset. He is the person you want in a crisis because he does not freeze, does not second guess, does not perform doubt when action is required. Those qualities are genuinely valuable, they kept people alive. The CDC sequence in the final episode of Season 1, an episode called TS-19, is particularly worth revisiting in the context of Shane's arc. The group has travelled to the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta on the theory that there might be answers there, or safety, or some remnant of the institutional world they once knew. What they find is a single scientist, Dr. Edwin Jenner, alone in a vast and dying facility, counting down the hours until the building's systems fail and the decontamination protocol triggers a thermobaric explosion that will destroy everything inside. Jenner locks the group in. He has decided, in his grief and his exhaustion, that death inside the CDC is preferable to survival outside it. The argument he makes is not incoherent. It is the argument of a man who has seen the data, who understands the scope of the catastrophe, and who has concluded that there is nothing left worth surviving for. He is offering them, in his own broken way, a mercy. The group argues, Dale pleads, Rick appeals to Jenner's humanity, and Shane acts. He threatens Jenner with a shotgun. He is physical and intense and genuinely frightening in the scene, and from a certain angle, he looks like the dangerous man the show is building toward. But he is also the man who is going to get everyone out of the building. He is the man who, when the argument is happening and the clock is ticking, decides that the argument is less important than the exit. That Jenner's philosophical position, however sincere, does not override the group's right to choose survival. Shane was right about the CDC. The building exploded. Everyone who stayed inside died. Everyone who got out, and they got out in significant part because Shane forced the issue, survived. The show does not pause to give Shane credit for this. It is already building the narrative that positions his intensity as a problem rather than a resource, but the credit is there in the text if you look for it. The pattern repeats across the early episodes. Shane argues for leaving the quarry camp before the Walker attack that kills Amy and Ed and several others. He is overruled. The attack happens. Shane argues for a more aggressive approach to the Walkers on the highway in what lies ahead. The Season 2 premiere. He is overruled. Sophia goes missing. The group spends half a season searching for a girl who is already dead, expending resources and time and emotional energy on a rescue mission that was never going to succeed. Shane's position that the search was consuming too much and that the group needed to accept the probability of Sophia's death and act accordingly was correct. It was also monstrous to say out loud to a grieving mother. Both things were true. Shane could not find a way to hold both of them at the same time. That is the recurring problem. Not that Shane's assessments were wrong, not that his instincts were faulty. The problem was that he could only ever articulate the cold version of the truth. And the cold version, even when accurate, was not sufficient to lead people. People do not follow cold truth, they follow warm conviction. Rick understood this, or at least performed it well enough that people could not tell the difference. Shane never learned it. The problem is not the qualities themselves. It is what happens to them when they lose their context. Decisiveness without accountability becomes recklessness. Clarity without compassion becomes cruelty. Shane's survival instincts, which were exactly the right tools for certain situations, became the wrong tools when applied to every situation, including the ones that required patience, trust, and the kind of long-horizon thinking that Shane was increasingly incapable of. Robert Kirkman, who created The Walking Dead and was involved in the television series, has spoken about Shane in terms that make clear the character was not a simple villain in the writer's room. Shane represented a real philosophical position, one that the writers took seriously and engaged with honestly. The argument Shane makes is not a straw man. It is a genuine position that thoughtful people can hold, and the show's project in seasons 1 and 2 was partly to explore what that position looks like when it is lived rather than merely argued. Here is the thing about Shane's logic that makes it more complicated than it first appears. It is not internally inconsistent. You can follow it. You can trace the steps from premise to conclusion and find that each one connects to the next in a way that makes sense within its own frame. The problem is the frame. The frame is missing something about what people are for, something about why survival matters in the first place, that Shane never managed to articulate and may never have been able to. He could tell you what it cost to keep people alive. He could not always tell you what they were being kept alive for. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The show is not ultimately arguing for Shane's philosophy. It is arguing against it, but it argues against it honestly, by showing the cost of both positions, by making Shane's predictions come true, even as it makes his character pay the price for the methods he used to arrive at them. That honesty is one of the things that makes the early seasons of The Walking Dead genuinely great television. It does not take the easy way out of the argument. It stays in it. And then there is the thing that most people find even harder to talk about than Shane's philosophy. The thing that sits underneath all of it, emotional and irreducible and impossible to argue away. Laurie Grimes is one of the most argued about characters in The Walking Dead's run, and almost none of the arguments about her are quite fair, to her or to Shane. What the show gives us when we look at the Laurie-Shane dynamic with some care is not a simple story of a predatory man taking advantage of a grieving woman. It is not a story of a faithless wife who used a convenient situation to act on suppressed desires. It is something genuinely messier than either of those readings. And the mess is the interesting part. Laurie Grimes, at the start of the series, believed that her husband was dead. That is not a small thing. She had watched the world collapse around her. She had a young child to protect. She had lost the person she had organised her life around. She was surviving, day by day, in conditions that most people cannot fully imagine, and she was doing it largely because Shane was there. Shane kept her safe. Shane kept Carl safe. Shane made decisions so that she did not have to make all of them alone. He was competent and present, and committed to her in a way that must have felt, in the context of that first terrible stretch of the apocalypse, like the only solid thing in a world that had stopped being solid. She turned to him. That is what people do. They turn to what is available, to what is warm, to what offers something resembling safety and connection in the absence of everything else. Laurie was not calculating. She was not manipulating. She was a grieving person in an impossible situation, making a human choice that had human consequences. The problem the show creates for Shane, and it is a genuine problem, not a cartoonish one, is that Laurie ends the relationship the moment Rick walks back into the camp. Immediately. Completely. And in the ending of it, she does not fully account for what Shane had become in the interim. Not just a temporary partner in a temporary situation, a man who had restructured his entire sense of purpose around her and Carl. A man who had spent however many weeks or months building a life, a real life, with real attachments, with a real investment in the future, and who was now being told that life was over because the person who made it necessary was no longer absent. The line is never that clean, of course. People are not light switches. Shane's feelings for Laurie, and the evidence suggests they were genuine, deeply so, did not simply switch off when Rick appeared. And Rick's appearance created a situation for Shane that had no template, no established way of navigating it. His best friend was alive. That was supposed to be good news, and in some part of him, it probably was, but it was also the undoing of the only coherent identity Shane had been able to build after the world fell apart. There is a scene early in the first season shortly after Rick's return to the group. That is easy to miss, but that contains multitudes. Shane watches Rick reunite with Laurie and Carl. The camera holds on Shane's face for several seconds. And what Bernthal plays in that moment is not jealousy, not immediately. What he plays is something closer to displacement. The specific experience of watching the thing you built get handed to someone else, not because you failed, but because the original owner came back. Imagine building a house in someone's absence, living in it, filling it with your life, and then watching the deed holder walk through the door and resume ownership. The house was never yours. You always knew it was never yours, but you lived in it. You kept it standing, and now you're being asked to step outside and pretend you were never there. That is Shane's experience of Rick's return, distilled to its emotional essence, and the show, to its credit, does not simplify it. Shane is glad Rick is alive. That gladness is real. Shane is also devastated by what Rick's return means for the life he had built. That devastation is also real. The two feelings do not cancel each other out. They coexist uncomfortably in every scene Shane shares with Rick for the rest of his time on the show. The tension between those two authentic responses, the gladness and the devastation, is the engine of Shane's deterioration. He is not being torn apart by one feeling. He is being torn apart by two feelings that cannot occupy the same space. Season 2, Episode 7, an episode called Pretty Much Dead Already, contains a scene that is among the show's most raw and genuinely uncomfortable. Shane confronts Laurie about the pregnancy. The conversation happens in a field, away from the others, and it is not a comfortable scene to watch. Shane needs to know if the child is his. The math of the timing is not conclusive. The show refuses to resolve this cleanly, and that refusal is one of its most honest creative choices. Because the unresolvability of it is the point. Shane might be a father, he will never know. The child, Judith, eventually, will be raised by Rick regardless of biology. And Shane knows this, and what it does to him is visible in every scene that follows. Think about what Shane was being asked to accept. Not just the loss of Laurie, not just the return of Rick, the possibility, real and unresolvable, that he might be the father of a child who would grow up calling another man Dad. That he might have created something in the ruins of the world, something living and real, and his, and have no claim to it, no access to it, no acknowledgement of it, and then be expected to continue operating within the group that contained all of this, side by side with the man who had taken his place. It was not a simple love triangle. It was not a villain stealing a man's wife. It was not even really about Laurie in the end. It was about what Shane had built in Rick's absence, and what it meant to have that taken away. Every piece of it at once, without any process of grief, because the loss could not be publicly acknowledged. You cannot mourn something that was never officially yours. The audience's response to the triangle tended to run along lines that were, in retrospect, fairly asymmetric. Shane was read as threatening, as possessive, as unwilling to accept a verdict that had been clearly issued. Laurie was largely read as a victim of his intensity, or at worst as a flawed person who had made an understandable mistake and was now being made to pay for it. Neither reading is entirely wrong. But the asymmetry, the degree to which Shane was blamed for the situation versus the degree to which Laurie was, is interesting, and it shaped how the rest of his arc was received. Sarah Wayne Callies, who played Laurie, and John Bernthal both discussed the triangle in interviews during and after the show's run, and both of them understood the dynamic differently from the way most viewers read it. Callies was consistent about the position she took, that Laurie was not a bad person, that her choices were understandable, that the relationship with Shane was genuine and not simply opportunistic. Bernthal was consistent about something different, that Shane's love for Laurie was real, that it was not performance or strategy, and that the inability to process the loss of that love was the engine of everything that followed. Shane did not stop loving Laurie when Rick came back. He just had nowhere to put it. That sentence is worth sitting with for a moment. because it is the emotional core of the whole situation. Love without an outlet, without acknowledgement, without the possibility of resolution, tends to transform. It does not simply dissipate. It finds other expressions, other channels, other forms. In Shane's case, it became entangled with his philosophical convictions, his protectiveness of Carl, his resentment of Rick's return, his increasingly aggressive relationship with the group's moral framework. The personal and the philosophical were not separable in Shane. They never were. The pregnancy subplot is the most honest thing the show does with Shane's story, in a strange way. It gives him something irreducible, something that cannot be argued away or dismissed as mere jealousy or instability. He might have been a father. That is not nothing. That is not a small thing that a person can simply set aside and continue functioning. It is the kind of thing that changes the texture of every moment that follows it, that sits at the edge of every interaction and every decision and every quiet moment of looking out at nothing in particular from a fence line at the edge of a farm. He never got to know, and that is the end of that thread. There is another relationship in Shane's orbit that tends to get overlooked in the focus on the love triangle, and it is worth spending some time with it because it illuminates something about Shane's character that the Laurie dynamic alone cannot fully capture. Shane and Andrea. Andrea Harrison, played by Laurie Holden, is one of the show's more complicated early characters. She begins the series as Dale's protege of sorts, a woman grieving her sister Amy, who was killed in the Walker attack on the quarry camp, and who is struggling to find her own sense of agency in a world that has taken everything familiar from her. Andrea is angry. She is grief-stricken. She is, by the early episodes of Season 2, increasingly alienated from the group's collective decision-making process, particularly from what she perceives as the group's tendency to keep her from fully participating in her own survival. She wants a gun, she wants a role, she wants to be treated as a competent adult rather than a person who needs to be protected. Shane is the person who gives her that, not Rick, not Dale, Shane. Their dynamic in Season 2 is one of the show's more quietly revealing relationships. Shane teaches Andrea to shoot. He takes her seriously as someone capable of violence in a world that requires it. He does not coddle her or protect her from the realities of what their situation demands. When they go to the housing development together on a supply run, a sequence that leads to one of the show's more debated scenes, what is happening between them is not simply physical attraction, though there is that too. What is happening is the recognition of a shared worldview. Andrea is the one person in the group, other than Shane himself, who is beginning to arrive at Shane's conclusions about what survival requires. She is the one person who does not recoil from his intensity because she is developing her own version of it. The show does not do nearly enough with this dynamic. It gestures at it, stages a few scenes around it, and then moves past it in the rush toward the barn and the field and the end of Shane's story. But what is there is interesting, because Andrea's arc after Shane's death, her eventual relationship with the governor, her inability to see him clearly, her death in Woodbury's prison cell, is in some ways a continuation of the trajectory that Shane's influence set in motion. Andrea learned from Shane that the world was hard and that hard people survived it. What she did not learn, because Shane never learned it himself, was how to distinguish between hard people who were building something and hard people who were destroying something. She could not tell the difference between Shane's pragmatism and the governor's pathology, because from the outside they wore the same face. The Andrea parallel also reveals something about the gendered dynamics of how the show treated Shane's philosophy. When Shane argued for pragmatic violence, the show coded it as dangerous, as evidence of a man unravelling. When Andrea began to adopt similar positions, when she took up the gun, when she stopped deferring to Dale's moral framework, when she asserted her right to make her own choices about risk and violence, the show treated it as a different kind of story. Not the story of a woman going mad exactly, but the story of a woman making poor choices, of a woman who could not read the room, who trusted the wrong people, who did not listen to the warnings. The narrative consequence was the same. Both Shane and Andrea ended up dead, both destroyed in part by the philosophy they had adopted, but the framing was different in ways that are worth noticing. Shane needed Andrea in a way the show never quite acknowledged. She was the only person in the group who understood what he was actually saying, rather than simply reacting to how he was saying it. And her presence in his orbit, brief, complicated, not fully explored, suggests that Shane's philosophy, separated from his personal entanglements and his increasingly desperate emotional state, was capable of being heard. Just not by the people he most needed to hear it. That is a loneliness the show never names. But it is there, underneath the surface of every scene where Shane stands apart from the group, looking at something nobody else wants to look at. He was alone in his understanding. And the one person who might have shared it was standing at the edge of the group too, learning to see the world the way he saw it, arriving too late to change anything. In Season 2, Episode 2, an episode called Bloodletting, Shane and a man named Otis run through a darkened high school, and only Shane comes back. That sentence is the Otis incident in its simplest form. But the simplest form is not the most useful one, because the Otis incident is complicated in ways that the Shane is going crazy reading tends to flatten. It is worth going through it carefully, because it is the moment most often cited as Shane's point of no return, and understanding what actually happened there and what it means is important to understanding Shane's arc as a whole. Carl Grimes has been shot. He was hit by a stray bullet from a rifle owned by Otis, a man who worked on Herschel Green's farm and who was out in the fields when Carl and Shane and some others came through. It was an accident. Otis was devastated. Carl needs surgery immediately, and Herschel, who is a veterinarian but who becomes the group's de facto medical resource, needs supplies from a FEMA shelter at the local high school. Specifically, he needs a respirator and other surgical equipment that are not available on the farm. Without those supplies, Carl dies. Shane and Otis volunteer to go together. Otis goes partly out of guilt. He shot the boy, and going to get the supplies is the only thing he can do that might help. They get to the school, they find the supplies, and then they are surrounded, overwhelmed by walkers drawn by the noise of their entry. They run. They are not going to make it. There are too many walkers, and Otis, who is a heavy-set man not built for extended running, is slowing down. The situation has one exit and two people trying to use it. Shane shoots Otis in the leg. Otis falls. The walkers go for him. Shane takes the supplies and escapes. He arrives back at the farm with what Herschel needs, and Carl survives. The utilitarian logic of this decision is not irrational, and it is worth stating plainly. If Shane does not escape, both men die and the supplies are lost, and Carl dies. If Shane escapes, one man dies and the supplies arrive, and Carl lives. In purely transactional terms, in terms of outcomes measured by bodies still breathing, Shane's choice produces the best result available. That is the argument he made to himself in the moment, and it is an argument that has a certain cold coherence, but the utilitarian logic is not sufficient, and the show knows it and shows us why. What Shane does after the school is the thing that actually reveals the shift in his character. He comes back to the farm. He tells the group that Otis died heroically, covering his escape so that Shane could get through. He constructs a false account of events and presents it with enough detail and emotional weight that it is accepted. He sits with Otis's grieving wife and maintains the lie. He shaves his head in a scene that is simultaneously self-punishment and reinvention. The razor against his skull, the mirror, the silence of a man doing something private and violent to himself that nobody else in the frame is supposed to see. Here is the thing about the Otis incident that makes it more complicated than it first appears. It is not the decision itself that changes Shane. A person can make a terrible decision in a terrible situation and still be capable of growth, of accounting for what happened, of carrying the weight of it honestly. The decision and the lie are not the same thing. Shane could have come back and told the truth. I shot Otis and left him to die, and I am living with that, and I do not know what to do with it. And that would have been a different person, making a different choice. A harder choice, probably, but a more honest one. One that kept the possibility of growth open. He chose the lie instead. He told a story about Otis that made Otis a hero, and made Shane a survivor of a tragedy, rather than the agent of one. And the lie closed something. Not immediately, not all at once, but from that point forward, Shane was a man who had used the apocalypse to justify something he could not justify to himself, and then buried the justification under a better story. That is what the head-shaving scene is about. The razor against the scalp is not just grief or guilt. It is a man changing his own appearance as part of the process of changing his own story. The Shane who went into the school is not the Shane who comes back. And the difference is not the decision, it is the burial of the decision. It is the lie. Pruitt Taylor Vince, who played Otis, gave the character enough specific humanity in a very short time to make his death genuinely costly. Otis was not a supporting character in the background. He was a man with a wife, a life, a deep sense of responsibility about the accident he had caused. He fought alongside Shane with real courage. He was trying to fix the thing he had broken. And Shane killed him, and then replaced the true story with a false one. And Otis's wife believed the false story. And the group believed the false story. And Shane was the only person in the world who knew what had actually happened. Patricia, Otis's wife, played by Jane McNeil, is the invisible casualty of Shane's decision. Not invisible in the sense that the show forgets about her, though it largely does. Invisible in the sense that her grief is built on a lie, and a grief built on a lie cannot properly resolve. She mourns a hero. She mourns a man who died saving a child. She does not know, will never know, that her husband died screaming, shot in the leg by the man she is now trusting to protect the group, left to be consumed by walkers, while his killer ran away, with the supplies in his arms. The comfort she takes from the false version of Otis's death is itself a kind of cruelty, though Shane probably did not think of it that way. He was solving a problem. The problem was that the truth would destroy his position in the group, and his position in the group was the only thing keeping Laurie and Carl safe. That is the logic. Follow it and it holds, but following it requires you to accept that Patricia's grief does not matter, that her right to the truth about her husband's death is subordinate to Shane's strategic calculation about the group's stability. And that acceptance, that willingness to weigh one person's reality against another's and decide which one gets to be real, is the specific moral compromise that the show is tracking. The scene in the Save the Last One episode, Season 2, Episode 3, which is the episode that actually stages the high school sequence, not bloodletting, which sets it up, is constructed with considerable technical skill. The episode intercuts between Shane and Otis running through the darkened school, and Shane back at the farm, already returned, sitting in the bathroom, staring at himself in the mirror. The audience does not know yet what happened. They know Shane came back. They know Otis did not. They know the story Shane told, and the intercutting creates a specific kind of dread. The dread of watching a man process something he cannot say out loud, intercut with the events that produce that processing. The moment Shane shoots Otis is not staged as a moment of madness. It is staged as a moment of calculation. Shane looks at Otis, he looks at the walkers, he does the math, and then he acts. The shooting is deliberate. The aftermath, Otis grabbing at Shane's pack, at his weapon, at anything that might save him, while Shane tears himself free, is horrible. But the decision itself is cold. It is clear. It is the decision of a man who has decided that one life matters more than another, and who is willing to enforce that decision with violence. That is a particular kind of moral weight, the kind that does not distribute itself or lighten with time, the kind that tends to become the organizing principle of a person's interior life, whether they want it to or not. Shane did not just make a hard choice in the school. He made a choice, and then he buried it. And that is a different thing entirely. The Otis incident is not the moment Shane became irredeemable. People have returned from harder places than that, from choices more clearly indefensible, through the difficult process of accounting honestly for what they did. The irredeemability was not in the choice, it was in the lie, and the lie, once made, required maintenance. It required Shane to continue being the person the lie described. It required that he construct an identity around the false version of events rather than the true one. And that ongoing construction, that continuous project of being someone he was not, is what made everything that followed increasingly unstable. Because growth requires honesty, and Shane chose the lie. There is a quiet coda to the Otis incident that the show stages in the episodes that follow, and it is easy to miss if you are focused on the larger plot movements. Shane becomes physically different after the school. Not just the shaved head, though that is the most visible marker. His body language shifts. The way he holds himself around the group changes. He becomes simultaneously more aggressive in his opinions and more isolated in his positioning, standing further from the others, sitting apart, occupying the edges of the frame rather than the centre. The geography of Shane's body in relation to the group is the show's visual metaphor for the moral distance the Otis lie has created. He is still present, he is still participating, but he is no longer fully inside. The lie has moved him to the perimeter, not because anyone else knows the truth, but because he knows it, and knowing it makes genuine proximity impossible. This is something Bernthal does with remarkable precision across the remaining episodes of Season 2. The incremental isolation. The way Shane's physical relationship to the group mirrors his moral relationship to it. He is drifting outward, scene by scene, and the drift is visible in the staging even before it becomes visible in the dialogue. The Walking Dead presents Rick and Shane as opposites, the man who held on to his humanity versus the man who surrendered his. And there is truth in that framing, just not as much truth as the show sometimes suggests. The Rick-Shane dynamic is the show's central philosophical engine in its first 2 seasons. Before the governor, before the prison, before any of the external antagonists who would come to define the series' later rhythms, the most interesting tension in The Walking Dead was internal. It was 2 men who knew each other, who had been shaped by the same world, who had been thrown into the same impossible situation, arriving at different conclusions about what survival required. That tension gave the early episodes their intellectual weight. It made the show feel like it was actually arguing something, rather than simply generating incident. What made the dynamic work was not the difference between the 2 men. It was the similarity. Shane and Rick were not opposites in temperament or capability, or even, at their core, in values. They were both protectors. They were both willing to use violence when they believed it was necessary. They were both motivated, fundamentally, by the desire to keep the people they loved safe. The difference was not in what they wanted, it was in how far they were willing to go to get it, and how quickly. That distinction, speed not direction, is something the show articulates with more honesty than it is usually given credit for. Rick was not opposed to hard choices. He was opposed to making them before every other option had been exhausted. Shane was not opposed to mercy. He was opposed to extending it when the cost of being wrong was other people's lives. Both positions have internal logic. Both positions produce failures. Rick's deliberation costs lives when the situation moves faster than the deliberative process. Shane's speed costs trust when the people around him feel overridden rather than consulted. The show stages these failures with equal care in the early seasons, even as its narrative grammar tilts the audience toward Rick. There is also the question of performance. Not acting performance, the performance of leadership. Rick performed deliberation even when he had already made up his mind. He performed consultation even when the outcome was predetermined. He performed doubt even when his certainty was complete. These performances were not dishonest. Exactly. They were the social technology that allowed the group to function. They were the difference between a leader who tells you what to do and a leader who makes you feel like you participated in the decision. Shane could not perform. He could not pretend to deliberate when he'd already decided. He could not stage a consultation he was not prepared to be changed by. That inability, that specific failure of social performance, is what made him dangerous to the group's cohesion, independent of whether his conclusions were correct. The specific ways Rick and Shane diverged are worth mapping out. Shane used violence as a first or near first resort. Rick used it as a last resort, or at least positioned himself as someone who used it as a last resort. Shane made decisions unilaterally when he believed the situation required it. Rick worked to maintain the appearance of collective decision-making even when his own judgment was largely driving outcomes. Shane was honest about the ugliness of what survival required. Rick wrapped the same ugliness in a framework that made it more palatable, to himself and to the group. But here is where the comparison gets genuinely interesting. The outcomes were often identical. The decisions that Rick eventually made, the hard, ugly, irreversible ones, were frequently the decisions Shane had argued for, sometimes seasons earlier. Rick executed Thomas in the prison in Season 3, a cold, deliberate killing of a man who had tried to have him killed, carried out without deliberation or group input. Shane would have done exactly that. Shane would have done it in Season 2 and been condemned for it. Rick did it in Season 3, and the show found a way to keep him inside the circle of moral acceptability. Rick banished Carol in Season 4 after she killed 2 infected members of the prison community, a decision she made alone on utilitarian grounds to prevent the spread of illness. Rick exiled her without consulting the group. Shane would have done the same, or possibly something worse, and it would have been presented as evidence of his deterioration. Rick did it, and it was presented as a painful but defensible exercise of leadership. Rick executed sleeping saviors in Season 6, men who had not yet attacked anyone, who were asleep in their beds, who were killed preemptively on the logic that they were a threat who would eventually become an active one. That sequence in an episode called Not Tomorrow Yet is worth looking at closely. Rick's group enters the Savior compound at night. They study the layout, they identify the sleeping men, and then they move through the compound, room by room, and they kill them. Glenn, the moral conscience of the younger generation, the pizza delivery boy who became a leader, drives a knife into a sleeping man's skull. The camera holds on Glenn's face afterward, and what you see there is not the face of a man who has done something he believes is right. It is the face of a man who has done something necessary and is already paying for it. Shane would have recognized that face. Shane would have understood exactly what Glenn was going through, because Shane had been through it at the high school with Otis. The difference is that when Shane made his version of that choice, the show treated it as evidence of his deterioration. When Rick organized a systematic assassination of sleeping enemies 3 seasons later, the show treated it as a painful but defensible tactical decision. The group mourned the cost, they struggled with the implications, but they did it, and they moved forward, and the show did not position it as the beginning of Rick's descent into madness. He bit a man's throat out with his teeth in Season 4 to save his son. That moment, in the Season 4 finale, an episode called A, is among the most visceral things the show ever staged. Rick and his group have been captured by a group called the Claimers, violent men operating without any framework beyond predation and force. The leader holds Carl at gunpoint. One of the Claimers begins to assault Carl. Rick, pinned and unable to reach a weapon, lunges at the leader and bites through his jugular vein. The man bleeds out in the dirt. Rick, covered in blood, then takes a knife and kills the man assaulting Carl with a violence that the camera does not shy away from. The scene is designed to be a turning point, and it is, but the turning point it represents is not the one the show perhaps intended. Because what Rick does in that scene, the primal animal violence of it, the willingness to abandon every tool of civilization in favour of teeth and desperation, is not a new thing in the world of The Walking Dead. It is exactly the thing Shane had been arguing for since Season 1. The willingness to do whatever the situation requires without hesitation, without the comfort of moral frameworks, without the luxury of process. Rick in that moment was not becoming something new. He was becoming Shane. He was arriving through his own long and painful route at exactly the place Shane had been standing 2 seasons earlier. He sanctioned and participated in acts of violence that would have been presented as monstrous if Shane had committed them in the earlier seasons. Think about what the show is actually asking you to believe here. It is asking you to believe that the same decisions made by different people, in service of different stated frameworks, carry fundamentally different moral weight, and the show sort of makes that argument work for long enough. Rick's violence is in service of community, of people he is building something with, for something that extends beyond himself. Shane's violence was, increasingly, in service of Shane. That distinction is real, and it matters, and it is where the show ultimately hangs its moral argument. But whether that distinction is as clean as the show believes it is, that is the question worth sitting with. Because there are moments in the later seasons where Rick's decision-making is almost indistinguishable from what Shane was doing in Season 2. And the show does not always have a clean framework for the difference. It relies heavily on the audience's accumulated goodwill toward Rick, on the emotional investment built over seasons, to smooth over moments where the logic of his choices and the logic of Shane's choices are running on parallel tracks. The line gets said out loud more than once in more than one season. Rick, you're becoming Shane. Various characters deliver some version of this observation at various points in the series. The show is aware of the convergence. It is not hiding it. It is making a point about the cost of survival, about what the apocalypse eventually does to even the most committed moral agent, about whether the frameworks we use to hold ourselves apart from our worst choices can actually bear the weight we put on them. Rick executed Thomas. Rick banished Carol. Rick slaughtered sleeping men in their beds. Rick bit a man's throat out with his teeth. And every time, the show found a way to keep Rick inside the circle of moral acceptability, because Rick was building something, because Rick was committed to a community beyond himself. That is the show's answer to the Shane problem, and it is a real answer. Shane's violence was eventually in service of Shane's survival and Shane's desires. Rick's violence was in service of the group, the larger project, the hope for something that would outlast the violence that made it possible. That difference matters. The show is right that it matters. By Season 5, Rick Grimes had done everything Shane Walsh ever did. He just did it for different reasons, which may have been enough. Shane's real function in the show, when you look back at it from a distance, is as a ghost. Not a literal one, not in the Walking Dead sense, though the show does have a complicated relationship with memory and haunting, but a thematic ghost, a set of choices and arguments and predictions that followed Rick through the rest of the series, present in every hard decision he made, audible in every conversation about what the group was willing to do and why. Shane did not simply die in the field in Season 2. He became the template, the cautionary tale, and the mirror and the measuring stick for everything that came after him. Season 2 of The Walking Dead spent a lot of time on Herschel Green's farm. More time, honestly, than a lot of people wanted to spend there. The pacing complaints about the farm arc are well documented and not entirely wrong. There is a stretch of the middle of Season 2 where the show's forward momentum feels genuinely stalled, where conversations repeat themselves and the central conflicts spin without resolving. That is a real problem with the season's construction, but underneath the pacing, the farm arc was doing something genuinely thoughtful. It was staging a philosophical debate in a contained space, with limited external action, forcing the characters to actually have the argument rather than survive their way past it. And that argument about whether pre-apocalyptic moral frameworks could survive the apocalypse, about what obligations the living owed to each other and to the concept of humanity itself, is one of the more interesting things the early show attempted. And yes, the characters stand in fields and talk, quite a lot. But what they are talking about turns out to be more substantive than it sometimes seemed. The farm as a symbolic space is worth unpacking. Herschel Green's farm is not just a location. It is a remnant of the old world systems, property rights, religious faith, the belief that the structures we built around human life still carried meaning after the structures themselves had collapsed. Herschel is a man of faith. He believes that the infected are sick people, not monsters. He keeps walkers in his barn because he cannot bring himself to kill them. Some of them are people he knew, people from his community, people whose human form he cannot yet dissociate from their current state. He holds on, with tremendous effort, to the idea that the world he understood is still the world that exists. That is Herschel's worldview as the farm's thesis, and it is presented with genuine sympathy. Scott Wilson, who played Herschel across the show's full run, gave the character a specific gravity, a moral weight that came not from certainty, but from the cost of maintaining conviction in the face of evidence. Herschel was not stupid. He was not naive. He was a man choosing, deliberately and with full knowledge of the difficulty, to hold on to something that the world around him was trying to take away. Shane's worldview is the farm's antithesis, and it is presented just as honestly. Shane's position on the barn, on Herschel's walkers, on the entire framework of mercy toward the infected, was that it was a comforting lie, that the walkers were not sick people waiting to be cured. They were dead people who would kill everyone around them if given the chance. Every resource spent maintaining the fiction that there was something else was a resource stolen from the living. Every delay was a risk that the living could not afford to take. And then Shane opened the barn. Season 2, Episode 7, an episode called Pretty Much Dead Already, contains the barn scene, which is probably the most argued about single sequence from the show's first 3 seasons. Shane gathers the group. He opens the barn doors. The walkers come out one by one, and the group shoots them down. It is violent, and it is loud, and it is terrible. And the last walker out of the barn is Sophia, a little girl the group had spent most of the first half of the season searching for, who had been in the barn the whole time, turned. The most honest thing Shane did on the farm was also the ugliest. That sentence captures the dual nature of the barn scene. Shane was right that the walkers in the barn needed to be dealt with. He was right that Herschel's framework was untenable. He was right that delaying the confrontation was costing the group something they could not get back. All of that is true, and the way he forced the confrontation, the timing of it, the lack of warning, the theatricality of it, was a form of violence against the group's trust in him, against Herschel's right to make decisions about his own property, against the process by which the group made hard choices together. Both things are simultaneously true. Shane was factually right and procedurally wrong. The barn needed to be dealt with. The way he dealt with it was a demonstration of exactly the problem the group had been trying to articulate about him. Not that his conclusions were false, but that he had decided his conclusions entitled him to act without consent, without process, without the community he was ostensibly protecting. There is a detail in the barn scene that tends to get lost in the spectacle of the shooting. After the walkers have been put down, after the gunfire has stopped and the bodies are on the ground, and the Green family is standing in horror at what has just happened to their loved ones, one more walker emerges from the darkness of the barn. Small, slow, wearing a blue rainbow t-shirt, Sophia, the little girl the group has been searching for all season, the girl Carol has been praying for, the girl Daryl nearly died trying to find, the girl whose absence has been the emotional engine of the entire first half of the season. She was in the barn the whole time, the group freezes. Every person who participated in the shooting freezes. Even Shane, who had been operating in a state of furious conviction seconds earlier, stops. He cannot shoot her. He cannot do the thing his philosophy demands in this specific instance, because the thing his philosophy demands is putting a bullet in the head of a 12-year-old girl in front of her mother. The calculation, the cold, clear, utilitarian math that had carried him through the rest of the barn, breaks against something in him that the math cannot reach. It is Rick who steps forward. Rick who raises his gun. Rick who fires the shot that puts Sophia down. And in that moment, in that specific, devastating moment, the show accomplishes something genuinely extraordinary. It inverts the dynamic. Shane, the pragmatist, the man who opened the barn, the man who argued that sentiment was a luxury the apocalypse could not afford, is the one who cannot pull the trigger. Rick, the man who argued for mercy and process and the maintenance of moral standards, is the one who does the hard thing that Shane's philosophy demanded, but that Shane himself could not perform. That inversion tells you something important about both men. It tells you that Shane's philosophy was more fragile than it appeared, that it could be maintained in the abstract against faceless walkers and strategic threats, but that it buckled when it was confronted with the specific, individuated humanity of a child everyone had loved. And it tells you that Rick's moral framework, for all its softness and all its emphasis on process, contained within it a capacity for hard action that Shane's more aggressive posture did not always match. Rick could do the terrible thing when the terrible thing needed doing. He just needed to believe it was the last resort. Shane needed it to be the first. The show's refusal to fully vindicate either Herschel or Shane is one of its most mature creative choices. Herschel's mercy was self-deception. Shane's clarity came at the cost of his humanity. The show suggests that the truth lives somewhere between them, but it only gestures at where. It does not provide the clean synthesis. It leaves the argument open, which is the right thing to do because the argument is genuinely not cleanly resolvable. The production context of the farm arc is worth mentioning. AMC, the network that aired The Walking Dead, was operating with a complicated set of budget constraints and creative pressures in Season 2. The farm setting was partly a cost-saving measure. Fewer locations, more contained production, less expensive than the large-scale sequences the show became known for in later seasons. But the writers used the constraint productively, in the way that constraints sometimes force creative people to do their best work. The limitation pushed the season toward character and argument. The conversations that happen on the farm, between Shane and Rick in Nebraska, between Dale and the group in Judge, Jury, Executioner, between Herschel and Rick in the quiet moments before everything falls apart, are some of the show's most genuinely argued scenes. The Dale-Shane dynamic deserves particular attention here, because it is the farm's most direct staging of the central philosophical debate, and because Dale's eventual death in that same season gives the debate a finality that it would not otherwise have had. Dale Horvath, played by Jeffrey DeMunn, occupies a specific role in the early group. He is the conscience. He is the man who remembers what the rules used to be, and who insists, with increasing desperation, that the rules still apply. Dale looks at Shane and sees something that frightens him. Not the physical danger, though that is real, but the philosophical danger. Dale understands, earlier than most of the group, that Shane is not simply a difficult person. Shane is an argument that, if accepted, would change what the group is in ways that cannot be reversed. The confrontation between Dale and Shane is pretty much dead. Already, the scene where Dale takes the group's guns and hides them in the swamps, and Shane tracks him down and demands them back, is one of the season's most revealing exchanges. Dale knows what Shane did to Otis. He does not have proof, but he knows in the way that people sometimes know things they cannot demonstrate. And Shane knows that Dale knows. The scene between them is not a confrontation between a good man and a bad man. It is a confrontation between two men who have looked at the same evidence and arrived at incompatible conclusions about what it means. Dale's final line to Shane in that scene, his statement that at least he can say, when the world fell apart, that it did not take him down with it, is one of the show's most quoted passages, and it is worth looking at honestly because it contains both a genuine truth and a genuine blindness. Dale is right that maintaining moral standards in the face of catastrophe is an act of courage. He is right that the willingness to abandon those standards, however pragmatic the justification, represents a kind of defeat. But Dale is also blind to something that Shane can see clearly, which is that maintaining those standards is easier when other people are doing the dirty work of keeping you alive. Dale can afford his principles because Shane is willing to do the things Dale's principles forbid. That dynamic, the moral authority of the person who benefits from violence without performing it, is something the show gestures at without fully exploring. It is one of the most interesting threads the farm arc leaves hanging. When Dale dies, killed by a walker in judge, jury, executioner, in a scene that is as much about the failure of his worldview as it is about the physical threat, the group loses its moral compass, and what replaces it in the subsequent episodes is a harder, more pragmatic sensibility that looks, if you are paying attention, a great deal like Shane's. The group does not acknowledge this. Rick does not stand over Dale's grave and say, Shane was right. But the decisions the group makes after Dale's death, the decision to execute Randall, the consolidation of authority under Rick, the gradual acceptance that the old rules no longer apply, are Shane's positions, adopted without attribution. The prophet dies, his prophecy lives on. The group kills the messenger and then reads the message. The show averaged nearly 7 million viewers in its second season, which represented meaningful growth over the first season's numbers, despite the pacing criticism. People were watching. They were watching, and many of them were frustrated with the farm, and they kept watching anyway. Something was working underneath the impatience. What the farm arc ultimately teaches is that old world moral frameworks are not simply portable into the new world. You cannot pick up the ethics of a stable civilization and carry them unchanged into a world that does not share the stability that produced them. But the answer is not to discard everything. The question, the genuinely hard question that Shane's arc raises and does not answer, is which parts you keep and which you let go. Shane's answer was let it all go. The evidence of his arc and of everything that follows it suggests that this answer was not livable. Herschel's answer was keep it all. The barn scene and everything that follows the barn scene suggests that this answer was not survivable. Rick is left trying to find the third option, the synthesis that neither of the available positions could provide. Whether he ever actually found it is a question the show spends its remaining 9 seasons circling without quite landing on. The barn was not Shane losing control, it was Shane refusing to pretend. And that distinction, the difference between a man acting out of genuine conviction and a man unravelling, is something the show sometimes makes clear and sometimes deliberately blurs, depending on what it needs Shane to be in any given moment. It is worth asking, in a fairly honest way, why Shane Walsh is so reliably misremembered. Not to be contrarian about it, not to score points against viewers who watched the show in good faith and arrived at reasonable conclusions based on what they saw, just because the shape of the misremembering is interesting in its own right. The pattern of it tells you something about how audiences engage with moral complexity in genre television, and about how narrative structure shapes character reception in ways that go deeper than conscious interpretation. The most fundamental issue is narrative positioning. Shane is set up as Rick's antagonist. Rick is the protagonist. The show is built around Rick, his perspective, his choices, his moral evolution. And narrative grammar, the grammar that storytelling has evolved over centuries of practice, trains audiences to read the protagonist's antagonist as wrong. Not necessarily evil, not necessarily stupid, but wrong. The antagonist exists in the classic structure to obstruct the protagonist, and obstruction is coded negatively. This is not a failure of any individual viewer. It is a consequence of how the show is structured, of the perspective it asks the audience to inhabit. When you watch The Walking Dead in Season 2 primarily through Rick's eyes, Shane reads as a threat. His arguments feel like obstacles. His predictions feel like provocations. His behaviour toward Laurie feels threatening. His physicality feels dangerous. The show is using all of its formal tools, camera angle, music, editing, to produce those responses. It is, in a very deliberate technical sense, asking you to read Shane that way. The specific formal choices are worth cataloguing because they are not accidental. Bear McCreary's score, which is among the most underappreciated elements of the early show's craft, shifts register when Shane is on screen. The music becomes tenser, more dissonant, more physically uncomfortable. The strings carry a different quality in Shane's scenes than in Rick's. A coiled, unresolved tension that the audience processes below the level of conscious attention, but that absolutely shapes how they read the character's behaviour. Listen to the music under a Shane scene, and then listen to the music under a Rick scene from the same episode. The difference is not subtle. The show is telling you, through its score, who to trust and who to fear. The camera work follows the same logic. Shane is frequently shot from below, looking up, a classic technique for making a character appear physically dominant and potentially threatening. Rick is more often shot at eye level, which produces an identification effect. The audience is positioned as Rick's equal, looking at the world from his perspective. Shane is positioned above the audience, looking down. These are basic filmmaking choices. They are also extraordinarily effective at shaping audience sympathy, and the show deploys them with precision. There is also the question of screen time allocation. The show gives the audience access to Rick's interior life in ways it does not give access to Shane's. Rick's doubts are voiced, his grief is staged, his moral deliberation is visible. The audience sees Rick working through his choices in real time, which creates empathy. The audience understands why Rick does what he does, even when what he does is violent or morally compromised. Shane's interior life is much less visible. His choices are presented more often as outcomes than as processes. The audience sees what Shane does. They do not always see the deliberation that preceded it. This is a structural choice, not an accident, and it systematically disadvantages Shane in the audience's moral accounting. The more demanding reading, the one where Shane is not crazy but coherent, not wrong about the facts but wrong about how to respond to them, requires working slightly against the grain of the show's formal apparatus. It requires asking, in the middle of a scene that is designed to make you feel a particular way, what this scene would look like from a different angle. That is additional interpretive work, and most people, watching a television show in a normal context, are not going to do it. They are going to trust the camera. That is what cameras are for. There is also what might be called the sympathy ratchet at work. Every time Shane does something that generates genuine sympathy, his attachment to Carl, the visible grief underneath his anger at the loss of Laurie, the sincerity with which he believes his own philosophy, the show almost immediately follows it with something that undermines it. The Otis lie, the scene in the woods with Laurie, the increasingly extreme behaviour toward Rick. The audience learned over time to distrust their own sympathy for Shane. They learned that warming to him was a setup for something that would cool that warmth again. And so they stopped allowing the warmth to develop. They moved the reading toward the simpler version, crazy, dangerous, beyond recovery, as a kind of emotional self-protection. The crazy reading is also just faster. It is cognitively simpler. A man who is losing his grip on sanity due to stress and jealousy and moral compromise is a familiar story type. A man who is coherent but wrong, whose logic is internally consistent but built on a premise that is ultimately insufficient, is a harder story type to process in real time. The show provides the crazy reading as an available option. Most viewers took it, which is understandable. The gender dynamics of the triangle also shaped audience alignment in ways that were probably not fully conscious. Viewers who identified with Laurie, who understood her position, who felt the vulnerability of a woman alone with a child in an apocalyptic landscape, tended to read Shane as threatening, as someone whose intensity and persistence and refusal to accept the end of the relationship constituted a form of danger. Viewers who identified with Rick, who understood what it would feel like to return from death to find your closest friend in your wife's bed, tended to read Shane as a usurper, a man who had taken advantage of a situation for his own benefit. Both of those readings have emotional logic to them. Neither is the complete picture. Here is the thing about narrative positioning that makes it especially powerful in Shane's case. It does not just affect how viewers read individual scenes, it retroactively reshapes how they remember earlier scenes. Once Shane is established in the viewer's mind as dangerous and antagonistic, the early scenes, the car conversation in the pilot, the genuine warmth with Carl, the hospital gurney, get resorted. They become evidence of a man performing normalcy rather than exhibiting it. The frame changes the content. The contrast with how Negan was received is instructive. Negan committed acts of violence in his first episode, the deaths of Abraham and Glenn, that were objectively more severe than anything Shane ever did. He was introduced as the show's most unambiguous villain, and yet Negan became one of the show's most popular characters, embraced by a significant portion of the audience in ways that Shane never was. This happened partly because of Jeffrey Dean Morgan's considerable charisma. It happened partly because the show allowed Negan's complexity to develop slowly over subsequent seasons, framing him as a man with a coherent worldview rather than simply an engine of violence. But it also happened because Negan was positioned outside the group. He was never competing with Rick for the audience's primary identification, never inside the circle of trust that Shane occupied. Think about what it means that the group never actually answered Shane's arguments. The group decided Shane was wrong. They decided he was dangerous. They pushed back against his methods and his behavior and his relationship to authority within the group. But in the actual debates, in Nebraska, in the Randall discussions in the barn, they did not prove him wrong. They did not find the flaw in his logic and expose it. They rejected his conclusions on emotional and moral grounds, and then, in the subsequent seasons, acted on those same conclusions without acknowledging the contradiction. They did not prove him wrong. They killed him. That is the shape of what happened. And misreading Shane is completely understandable. The show designs for it in certain ways, and narrative grammar does the rest. But the more complete reading is there in the text if you look for it. You can find Shane's logic, intact and coherent, underneath the behaviour the show uses to make him difficult to root for. And looking for it, working through the formal apparatus of the show to find what the show is actually arguing versus what it is asking you to feel, turns out to be one of the more rewarding things the series makes available to a patient viewer. Because when you read Shane completely, something interesting happens. He starts to look less like the show's villain and more like its first prophet. There is a particular irony in how The Walking Dead remembered Shane Walsh after his death. Because almost everything Shane said would happen, about the world, about what it would require, about what Rick would eventually become, turned out to be true. The show spent 9 more seasons after Shane's death demonstrating, one storyline at a time, that his assessment of the apocalypse was more accurate than the assessment that got him killed. His predictions, stated plainly, look like this. The world outside is not coming back. There is no government coming, no rescue mission, no restoration of the systems that organise the old life. Any hope invested in those things is hope that cannot survive contact with reality. Every soft choice costs lives. Not immediately, and not always obviously, but eventually and irreversibly. The infected cannot be accommodated. They are not sick people awaiting treatment. They are a permanent feature of the new landscape, and pretending otherwise is fatal. The stranger is a threat until proven otherwise. Strength is not optional. The communities that survive will be the ones that can defend themselves, and the ones that believe mercy alone is sufficient will not survive. The governor proved this. The prison community believed that it could build something stable and protected, and the governor dismantled it. Terminus proved this. Gareth and his community had arrived at exactly the survival philosophy Shane had argued for, and extended it to its most extreme conclusion, which was cannibalism. The wolves proved this. Alexandria, the community that Rick's group eventually joined, was full of people who had survived by not quite understanding what they were surviving in, and they paid for it repeatedly. Negan proved this more comprehensively than anyone else in the show's run. A man who had organised Shane's philosophy into a functional society, who had built systems of control and resource extraction on the premise that strength was the only legitimate currency. Shane was right about the rescue. He was right about the strangers. He was right about the farm. He was right about what Rick would have to become. He was right about almost everything. He just turned out to be wrong about himself. The Alexandria arc, beginning in Season 5, is perhaps the most sustained vindication of Shane's worldview in the entire series. Rick's group arrives at Alexandria, a walled community in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., run by a congresswoman named Deanna Monroe, populated by people who have survived the apocalypse largely by not engaging with it. They have walls, they have houses, they have the trappings of the old world, dinner parties, job assignments, a judicial system of sorts, and they are, by any honest assessment, catastrophically unprepared for the reality that exists outside their walls. Rick sees this immediately. He sees that the Alexandrians have not been hardened by the world, that they have been sheltered from it, and that this shelter has made them vulnerable in ways they do not understand. His response, which the show stages with deliberate ambiguity, is to begin quietly preparing for the moment when the community's illusions will be shattered. He takes weapons. He assesses the defences. He identifies the weak points. He does, in other words, exactly what Shane would have done. He treats the community's softness not as something to be admired, but as something to be corrected, forcefully if necessary. The famous speech Rick gives at the town meeting in Season 5, blood on his face, gun in his hand, the civilized world staring at him in horror, is Shane's speech. It is the barn scene, restaged in a living room, with better lighting and worse consequences. Rick is telling the Alexandrians what Shane tried to tell the group at the farm, that their way of life is unsustainable, that the world outside will come for them eventually, and that the only question is whether they will be ready when it does. The Alexandrians react the way the group reacted to Shane, with horror, with rejection, with the conviction that this man has lost his way. And then the wolves attack, and the herd breaches the walls, and everything Rick warned them about comes true, and the community survives only because Rick's group, hardened by exactly the kind of brutal experience that Shane had understood from the beginning, is there to defend it. Think about what that pattern means. Viewed from a distance, Shane argues for a position. The group rejects it. Shane dies. The position turns out to be correct. The group adopts it under Rick's leadership and survives because of it. The specific man who first articulated the philosophy is dead, but the philosophy lives on in the man who killed him. There is something genuinely Shakespearean about that dynamic. The king who kills the prophet and then becomes the prophet's most faithful disciple. That last part is worth being precise about. Shane's predictions about the external world, about the nature of the apocalypse and what it would require, were accurate. His predictions about his own internal state, about whether he could hold a position of authority within the group, about whether his feelings for Laurie and Carl could be made compatible with the group's stability, about whether he was capable of being the kind of leader he believed the situation required, those were less accurate. Shane overestimated his ability to compartmentalize. He underestimated how much the emotional entanglements he could not resolve would corrupt the practical clarity he believed he had. The governor is the figure who makes the Shane as prophet comparison most vivid. David Morrissey's governor is, in structure, almost identical to Shane, a man who uses violence pragmatically, who believes that community requires hard choices, who loves those inside his circle with genuine ferocity and is ruthless to those outside it. The governor built a community. Shane never managed that. Shane was always, in the end, a lone wolf trying to operate inside a group that was not organised around his philosophy. The governor took Shane's convictions and added organisation, scale, and the willingness to construct the social infrastructure that Shane could never maintain. He also took Shane's pathology and scaled that up too, which is what eventually destroyed him. Negan is Shane with better organisation and considerably more charisma. The argument Negan makes is that strength is the only legitimate organising principle, that the protection he offers is worth the tribute he extracts, that the alternative to his system is the chaos that kills everyone, is Shane's argument in a more evolved form. Negan built what Shane was trying to build, roughly the same thing Shane thought he was trying to build, with a clearer understanding of what it would take to sustain it. The saviours are Shane's worldview, institutionalised. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you are enjoying this breakdown. The Whisperers took Shane's logic to its most extreme philosophical conclusion. A faction that had given up entirely on the idea of human civilization, that lived among the dead, that had abandoned the distinction between the living world and the dead world. They are Shane's premise, that the old world's frameworks were incompatible with survival, extended to the point where even the concept of community itself was discarded. Shane never went that far. He was always trying to preserve something, some people, some version of the project, but the Whisperers are where his logic leads, if you follow it without stopping. Season 7, Episode 1, an episode called The Day Will Come When You Won't Be, is the premiere that reset the show's moral baseline to something that Shane would have recognised immediately. Negan's arrival, the killings, the demonstration of power, all of it was designed to show Rick's group that the world Shane had described was the real world, that the interlude of hope and community building was over, that the hard math was back. Rick's group spent the first half of the show's run learning, slowly and painfully, the lesson Shane had been trying to teach them in Season 2. Shane did not survive long enough to be proven right, but the show spent 9 more seasons proving him right anyway. The specific irony of this, that the show killed the character who most accurately understood the world it was depicting and then spent the rest of its run depicting the world he described, is worth sitting with quietly. It is not an accident. It is a consequence of the show's genuine engagement with the question Shane raised. The show was not trying to dismiss Shane's philosophy as simply wrong. It was trying to argue that the philosophy, however accurate its predictions, was not sufficient as a guide to how to live. That being right about the hard things was not enough if you could not find a way to remain human while being right about them. That is a genuine argument. It is the show's central argument underneath everything. Shane is the character who makes it possible to have that argument because he is the character who forces it into the open. He is the one who makes the group and the audience actually think about what they believe and why. That is not a villain's function. That is a prophet's function. And the fact that prophets are rarely well received by the people they are prophesying to is, in Shane's case, the most accurate thing the show ever said about him. Jon Bernthal is a physically imposing actor. That tends to be the first thing people notice. He is broad and he is intense, and he carries a kind of weight in the way he occupies space that reads as dangerous before he has done anything to justify the reading. In a show about survival in a violent world, that physicality is useful. Casting a physically imposing actor as the group's most aggressive member is not a complicated choice, but the physicality is also the thing that tends to obscure what Bernthal was doing technically with Shane. Because underneath the bulk and the intensity and the physical presence, there was a great deal of very precise, very deliberate acting work happening, work that shaped the character's complexity in ways that the show's narrative sometimes tried to flatten, and that a careful viewer can see if they look for it. Bernthal made a deliberate choice, apparently established early in the process of playing Shane, to inhabit the character's body differently as the character deteriorated. The Shane of the season, one patrol car scene is physically relaxed. He moves with ease, his posture is open, his breath is full, his eye contact is the easy kind that people use when they're comfortable and not monitoring themselves. That Shane is genuinely at home in his body and in the world. By season 2, the same body is different. The posture is tighter. The jaw carries tension that does not release. The breathing is shallower and faster, barely noticeable, but present in the close-ups that the show uses frequently during the farm sequences. The eye contact is a different kind of intense, not the easy watchfulness of someone comfortable, but the vigilant watchfulness of someone who has learned not to stop monitoring. This is not just character deterioration rendered through behaviour. It is specific physical work, the kind that requires a performer to maintain fine-grained awareness of how their body communicates in front of a camera, continuously, across months of production. The acting challenge of playing Shane was unusual. Bernthal had to make Shane's logic legible, had to let the audience understand, moment by moment, the internal reasoning that was producing Shane's choices, without making it sympathetic in ways that would undermine the show's moral argument. This is a genuinely difficult needle to thread. Too sympathetic, and Shane becomes the hero of his own story in ways that compromise the show's thesis. Too opaque, and the audience has no way in, no access to the coherent interior that makes Shane interesting, rather than simply dangerous. The barn sequence in Pretty Much Dead already is the clearest demonstration of what Bernthal was doing technically. Shane in the barn is not playing madness. He's not playing breakdown or dissociation or the loss of cognitive function that the going crazy reading would suggest. He is playing conviction. He is playing a man who has arrived at a conclusion and is acting on it, fully and without hesitation, in the belief that he is doing something necessary. The intensity of the barn scene comes not from irrationality, but from the specific quality of absolute certainty, the particular energy of a person who has decided that they are right, and who is now acting without the friction of doubt. That is a much harder thing to play than madness. Madness can be performed through standard theatrical conventions, the erratic movement, the disconnected speech, the visible fragmentation of the social self. Conviction of the kind Bernthal is playing in the barn has to come from somewhere genuine. It has to feel earned and specific. And it does. Whatever you think of Shane's choices in that scene, you understand them. You understand how he got there. That understanding is Bernthal's contribution. The head-shaving scene is something else, a different kind of technical challenge. It is wordless, almost entirely physical. The scene's content is shame and self-punishment, and a specific kind of internal reorganization, and none of those things can be stated out loud. They have to be communicated through the quality of the gesture, the way Bernthal holds the razor, the particular blankness of his expression that is not actual blankness but a very specific internal weather that reads from the outside as emptiness. It is among the show's most carefully constructed silent sequences, and it communicates, if you watch it without knowing what came before it in the school, that something has happened. Something costly and irreversible that this man is now building a new self around. What is technically remarkable about the head-shaving scene is its duration. The show holds on Bernthal for an extended take, long enough to be uncomfortable, long enough for the audience to shift from watching to witnessing. There is no cutaway to another character's reaction. There is no music cue that tells you what to feel. There is just a man, a razor, and a mirror, and the accumulated weight of everything the audience knows about what happened at the school, bearing down on a face that will not tell you what it is thinking. The scene asks the audience to do interpretive work, to read the interior state from the exterior evidence, and Bernthal's contribution is making that work possible without making it easy. He gives you enough to know something is happening. He does not give you enough to know exactly what. That gap between what the audience can see and what it can conclude is where the character's depth lives. It is worth comparing the head-shaving scene to similar moments in Bernthal's later career because the technique is consistent. The Punisher, which gave Bernthal his most sustained leading role, repeatedly stages moments where Frank Castle processes grief and violence in silence, through physical expression rather than dialogue. The technique is the same: the controlled stillness, the specificity of the tension in the body. The way Bernthal's characters communicate their interior states through the quality of their physical presence rather than through words. What he learned on The Walking Dead, or what he brought to The Walking Dead and refined there, became the foundation of a performance style that has defined his career. The show also gave Bernthal something that many actors never receive: a scene partner of genuine quality. Andrew Lincoln's Rick Grimes is, in the full sweep of the series, one of television's more underrated leading performances. Lincoln is a British actor playing a Georgia sheriff's deputy, and the dialect work alone would have defeated most performers. But Lincoln brought something more than technical competence to Rick. He brought a specific kind of decency, a stubborn, not always rational commitment to the idea that people can be better than their circumstances, that made Rick's moral framework feel inhabited rather than imposed. When Bernthal's Shane argued with Lincoln's Rick, the argument felt real because both performances were fully committed. Neither actor was phoning in their side of the debate. The scenes between them carry a weight that the show would spend years trying to recapture, with other pairings and never quite managing. The final confrontation with Rick in Season 2, Episode 12, an episode called Better Angels, is the scene that requires the most from Bernthal, and the one that most clearly demonstrates what the performance had been building toward. Shane engineers the confrontation. He decides to force the moment rather than wait for it, to bring the conflict between himself and Rick to its conclusion in a way and at a time he controls. He goes out into the field with Rick under false pretenses, and he is not going because he has lost his grip on reality. He is going because he has looked at the situation completely and arrived at a conclusion. Rick is going to have to deal with Shane eventually. Shane is going to have to deal with Rick eventually. Shane, in his analysis, should control the terms. What Bernthal plays in that sequence is not a man who has gone past the point of rational thought. It is a man who has made a decision he cannot take back and is now living inside the consequences of it. The moment when he understands that Rick has figured out what Shane was planning, the shift in Shane's expression when the situation pivots, is the scene's defining moment. It is very small. It lasts perhaps a second. And in that second, Bernthal plays about 6 things at once: recognition, resignation, something that might be relief, something that might be grief, and underneath it all, the specific quietness of a man who has run out of arguments. Nothing the show produced in its first 2 seasons required more from an actor than Shane's final 10 minutes, and Bernthal met it. His subsequent career is worth noting, not as a detour, but as context. The Punisher, the role that brought him to the widest audience outside of The Walking Dead, built on many of the same qualities: the physicality, the intensity, the ability to make violence feel inhabited rather than performed. The Many Saints of Newark, his work with Martin Scorsese, his continued presence in prestige television and film. These are the resume of a working actor at the top of his craft. What he did with Shane was not an accident of the moment. It was evidence of a level of technical accomplishment that was present from the beginning, and that The Walking Dead gave particularly good material to work with. The character was written to be understood. Bernthal made him felt. That is the distinction that matters. Shane on the page is a coherent and genuinely complex character. The arguments are in the script. The moral architecture is in the script, but the specific texture of the experience of watching him, the feeling of understanding how he arrived at his choices, the feeling of sympathy and unease coexisting in the same moment, the feeling of watching something real rather than constructed, that is Bernthal's contribution. And it is, in the full history of the series, one of the things the show did best. Shane Walsh dies in Season 2, Episode 12, an episode called Better Angels, which aired on March 11th, 2012. The show ran for another 10 years after that, and for those 10 years, it kept trying to replace what Shane had provided. Not Shane the character, exactly. Not the specific relationships and storylines and scenes, but what he gave the show structurally, the function he performed in the narrative architecture of the early seasons. Because what Shane gave The Walking Dead was something genuinely rare and genuinely valuable. A real internal antagonist. Someone inside the group, inside the circle of trust, who challenged the group's moral framework from a position of intelligence and commitment rather than malice. And that is structurally different, fundamentally, importantly different from an external villain. The parade of external villains that followed Shane's death is impressive in its scale. The Governor, Seasons 3 and 4. Gareth and the Terminus Community, Season 5. Dawn at Grady Memorial, The Wolves. Negan and the Saviours, Seasons 6 through 8. Simon. Alpha and Beta and the Whisperers. Every one of them is a threat that comes from outside. Every one of them tests the group's ability to survive. None of them tests the group's ability to understand itself. After Shane, the show never again put the philosophical challenge inside the group's circle of trust. It never again staged the argument about what kind of people the survivors were trying to be as an internal debate, as a conflict between people who were on the same side and disagreed about what that meant. It externalized the argument. It found new villains who articulated Shane-adjacent philosophies from outside, as threats to be defeated rather than positions to be engaged with. What internal antagonism provides that external antagonism cannot is hard to quantify, but important to name. When Shane argued with Rick about the Randall situation, both of them were invested in the group's survival. Both of them wanted Carl to live. Both of them were operating from a commitment to the people around them. The argument was about method, about philosophy, about what kind of community they were building and what that community was entitled to do in its own defense. External villains, the Governor, Negan, the Whisperers, could not produce that argument because they were outside the conversation. Their presence forced the group to defend itself, which is not the same as forcing the group to examine itself. The specific failure is easier to see in retrospect, as Rick increasingly made decisions that were, in method, if not in stated intent, indistinguishable from Shane's decisions. There was no one left to say so. No one inside the group who had the standing and the intelligence and the long enough history with Rick to look at what he was doing and name it. Carol came close, in Seasons 3 and 4, to performing a Shane-adjacent function. Her pragmatism, her willingness to make hard choices without consultation, her ability to see clearly what others preferred not to see. But Carol never engaged Rick in sustained philosophical argument about the group's values. She made decisions unilaterally and absorbed the consequences, Shane argued. Carol acted. The difference matters. Michonne in her early seasons was coded briefly as a lone wolf whose values were not fully compatible with the group's. But the show moved quickly to integrate her into the group's emotional architecture, to make her Rick's partner and Carl's surrogate mother, and in doing so, moved her away from the Shane-adjacent structural function. She became an insider, warmly and completely, in a way that precluded the kind of internal antagonism Shane had represented. The irony of Rick's arc is sharpest if you hold the Shane parallel in mind. As Rick made choices that Shane would have recognized immediately, would have endorsed even, there was no one left who knew Rick well enough, and who had long enough history with both men to point out the convergence. The character, who could have served as Rick's honest interlocutor through all of it, was in the ground in King County. The argument that should have been internal became, by necessity, external. And external arguments in The Walking Dead were resolved by violence, not by conversation. The show's response to this structural absence, the absence of internal challenge, was to scale up the external threats, to make the villains bigger and more theatrical, to increase the spectacle of the conflicts in place of the depth of them. Negan's arrival in Season 7 is the most extreme example. 17 million live viewers for the premiere, which was the show's most discussed episode in years, entirely on the strength of who died and how. The sequence was pure external spectacle. It was extraordinarily effective as a shock delivery mechanism. It was not doing what Shane and Rick in a patrol car in episode 2 of Season 2 was doing. The Negan comparison is worth extending because it illustrates the structural difference with precision. Jeffrey Dean Morgan brought enormous charisma and genuine menace to the role. Negan was, by any standard of villain construction, a well-built antagonist. He had a philosophy, he had a system, he had charisma and intelligence and a willingness to be theatrical about his violence in ways that made for compelling television. But he was outside the group. He was attacking the group. He was not asking the group to examine its own premises. He was confirming the group's premises, that they were good people under siege from bad people, and the only question was whether the good people would prevail. That is a fundamentally different kind of dramatic engine than what Shane provided. Shane did not confirm the group's self-image. He challenged it. He forced the question that the group preferred not to ask. Are we actually good people? Or are we people who have been able to afford the performance of goodness because we have not yet been pushed hard enough to find out what we really are? That question, internal, uncomfortable, genuinely difficult, is what made the early seasons of the show genuinely great. And the show never found another way to ask it after Shane was gone. Daryl Dixon, who became the show's most popular character and its de facto co-lead alongside Rick, is instructive in this regard. Norman Reedus's Daryl is a magnificent television character, complex, evolving, genuinely beloved by the audience for reasons that are entirely defensible. But Daryl's complexity operates in a different register than Shane's. Daryl's journey is about growth, about a man from a damaged background learning to trust, to connect, to become part of something larger than himself. It is a hopeful arc. It is an arc that confirms what the audience wants to believe about human beings, that people can change, that goodness is not fixed at birth, that the worst among us can become something better. Shane's arc confirmed nothing the audience wanted to believe. It raised questions without answering them. It presented a version of human behaviour under extreme stress that was coherent and terrifying and genuinely arguable, and it forced the audience to sit with the discomfort of not knowing whether to root for it or against it. That is harder television. It is also better television, in the specific sense that it demands more from the viewer and rewards the demands it makes. The show was never again as intellectually ambitious as it was when Shane was alive. It became, after his death, a show about survival against external threats, rather than a show about the internal cost of the decisions survival requires. Those are not the same show. The first one was better. The numbers tell part of the story. Season 1's Metacritic score was 82. Season 2's was 80. The critical trajectory declined in the later seasons, with Rotten Tomatoes scores dropping to 66% in Season 7 and 65% in Season 8. The trajectory is not attributable to any single decision, but the decision to remove the internal philosophical engine of the show, to kill the character who made the argument live, was one of the earliest and most consequential steps in that trajectory. Robert Kirkman has spoken about killing Shane as both a necessary creative choice and one that permanently changed the show's internal dynamic. In the comic, Shane died very early, before the farm, before most of what the television version built around him. The television version extended Shane's life significantly, gave him the farm and the full second season, let the argument develop at length. That extension was one of the early show's best creative decisions. What followed it, the absence, the structural void, was one of the costs. Killing Shane was the right dramatic decision. It was also the most expensive one the show ever made. His arc was complete. His death was earned by the logic of the story. Rick had to be the one to deal with it, and he did. And the consequences of that dealing rippled through Rick's character for the rest of the series. None of that is wrong. All of it was necessary. The manner of Shane's death is worth one final examination, because it contains the show's most honest commentary on the relationship between these two men. Shane engineers the confrontation. He lures Rick out into the field under false pretenses, intending to kill him. Rick understands what is happening, and instead of running, instead of calling for help, instead of any of the rational responses that the situation would seem to demand, Rick walks into it. He goes to the field with Shane. He stands there in the moonlight, and he lets the conversation happen. Rick kills Shane with a knife, not a gun, not from a distance. He closes the distance between them, puts his arms around Shane, and drives the blade into his chest. It is the most intimate act of violence the show ever staged. Two men who loved each other, who had built their lives around each other, who had been closer than brothers, locked together in the dark while one of them dies. Rick weeps. He holds Shane. He says through his grief that Shane brought this on himself. All of that is true, and all of it is complicated by the fact that Rick did not have to do it this way. He could have shot Shane from 10 feet away. He chose the knife. He chose the proximity. He chose to feel it happen. Carl appears. Shane reanimates. The first time the show reveals that everyone is infected, that death from any cause produces a walker. Carl shoots the reanimated Shane, and Rick, standing over the body of the man who was his best friend, his partner, his rival, and his shadow, understands something that will define the rest of his story. He understands that the world Shane described was the real world, and he understands that living in it honestly, not pretending it was something else, not wrapping the hard truth in comfortable fictions, was the only way to survive it without becoming something he could not live with. But the shape of the absence Shane left behind, the parade of external villains who could not do what he did, the philosophical debates that got externalized instead of lived, the escalating spectacle that replaced the quiet, uncomfortable arguments. That shape tells you something important. It tells you what Shane was actually providing. The show struggled to replace it because what he provided was genuinely difficult to provide. A character who is inside the group, committed to its survival, intelligent enough to make real arguments, wrong in ways that are specific and defensible rather than simply pathological. That character is not easy to build. The Walking Dead built one of them, and then it had him killed in a field in Georgia in the spring of 2012, and spent the next decade trying to fill the space. So, Shane Walsh, standing at that fence line at the edge of the green farm, looking out at nothing in particular, knowing things nobody wanted him to know, being right about things nobody wanted him to be right about, carrying things nobody wanted to help him carry, and standing there, anyway, very still, in the early morning light. That image is where this started, and it is where this ends, because it is the image that captures something true about who he was and what he represented. Shane Walsh was a man who understood the world the show was depicting more clearly than most of the people around him. He understood it early and at cost, and without the narrative support structures that made Rick's version of the same understanding palatable to the audience. He was the prophet who arrived before anyone was ready for the message. He was the mirror that showed the group and the show what survival actually looked like when you removed the comfortable fictions from it. He was not a hero. He did not earn that word by the end. The Otis lie cost him something irreversible. The violence against Rick, the attempted assault on Laurie, the way he stopped being able to hold his own worst impulses in check. All of that is real, and none of it can be argued away. He became genuinely someone the group could not continue with. The story was right to end where it ended, but he was not simply a villain either. He was not a man who went crazy. He was not a predator who saw opportunity in catastrophe. He was a man who loved genuinely, who thought seriously, who saw clearly, and who could not find a way to hold all of those things together under the weight of what the world had become. That is a tragedy. A specific, human, comprehensible tragedy. Not a moral lesson neatly packaged. Just a man who was in an impossible position and could not find the impossible exit. The show understood this, even when its narrative machinery was working to simplify it. There is a moment in season 3, long after Shane's death, long after his body is in the ground at the farm, when Rick hallucinates Shane during the rescue of Glenn and Maggie from Woodbury. The hallucination appears briefly, in a moment of stress, and Rick reacts to it with something that is not quite fear, and not quite grief, but something in between. The show is telling you, in that moment, that Shane is not gone. Not from the story, not from Rick's interior life, not from the argument that the two of them were having, which is the argument the show was built on, and which Rick will spend the rest of his arc trying to resolve. Shane Walsh lives in every hard decision Rick makes for the rest of the series. He lives in the moment Rick kills the Claimers. He lives in the moment Rick walks into Alexandria and sees softness where he should see strength. He lives in the moment Rick decides to fight Negan rather than submit to him. He lives in the moment Rick at the end of the war chooses mercy over vengeance. Because that choice, the choice to stop, the choice to not become fully what Shane became, is a choice that only has meaning if Shane's alternative is real and present and available. You cannot choose mercy if violence is not an option, and violence was always Shane's option. Rick's mercy, when it comes, is made meaningful by Shane's ghost. That is the final measure of a character's significance. Not how long they survived, not how many episodes they appeared in, but whether the story could have existed without them. The Walking Dead without Shane Walsh is a show about people fighting zombies. The Walking Dead with Shane Walsh is a show about what survival costs and whether the cost is worth paying. Those are not the same show. The second one is the one that mattered. John Bernthal gave him his interior life. The show gave him his argument. The argument was never refuted. Bernthal's performance was never anything less than fully committed. And the character who emerged from those two things, the writing and the performance working together across 2 seasons of genuinely difficult television, is one of the more honest portraits the show ever produced. Honest about what the apocalypse costs, honest about what survival requires, honest about the distance between being right and being good. That is what Shane was, underneath everything. The character who forced the question, who made the group and the show and the audience actually sit with the argument rather than simply surviving past it. And that in the end is worth sitting with. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.